Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 249, Pizarro and Atahualpa. Last time, I introduced Atahualpa and ended the episode with him making the empire-altering decision to go and meet the strange band of visitors presently making their way through the Andes. This band of visitors, 168 Spaniards to be precise, were led by one Francisco Pizarro. Pizarro now had permission to conquer the Inca in the name of Charles V, King of Spain. But how in the world was Pizarro going to do that with only 168 men? Well, to be frank, he's going to take a page out of Hernando Cortez's playbook, that's how. Today, the two men, Pizarro and Atahualpa, meet. Pizarro makes a fateful decision. Atahualpa makes a critical mistake. And history takes a dramatic turn. As he walked through the ruins of Tumbes, Pizarro learned the general outlines of the current military situation in Peru. He had landed on the outskirts of an empire that one of the two royal brothers had been fighting over. The ruler whom Pizarro had heard about when he was last there several years earlier, Huayna Capac, was now dead. Tumbes was in ruins because the inhabitants of that city, not ethnic Incas technically, had sided with one of the two brothers, Huascar, and that city had thus been razed by the armies of Huascar's brother, Atahualpa, who was currently with an army in the mountains only about 200 miles or about 2 weeks' march to the southeast. But not necessarily grim news for Pizarro, after all. News of native warfare, disease, and devastation could only have piqued his interest. 12 years earlier in Mexico, Hernando Cortez had effectively exploited native political divisions to help to bring down the Mexica. Here, by the sounds of it, Pizarro had arrived at the tail end of a full-fledged civil war. With any luck, he almost certainly realized he could ally himself with one side or the other, either the victor or the loser. It didn't really matter because what he wanted was legitimacy. His goal, of course, he wouldn't tell either side this, but his goal was to destroy both sides. In order for that to happen, though, he would first need to make contact with one of the warring factions. Pizarro and his men now became the first Europeans to enter the Andes. As they traveled along the winding but well-maintained mountain roads, Pizarro became increasingly nervous. Evidently, they stumbled upon a town which had been loyal to Huascar. The town was abandoned, but a string of swaying corpses, strung from a hastily constructed gallows, indicated that Atahualpa had not been inclined to be merciful to those who supported his half-brother. What did that mean for them, the Spaniards? Pizarro at one point managed to capture a messenger, and, under torture, the man confessed that Atahualpa was coming their way, and that he intended to kill them all. This wasn't expressly true, but it confirmed Pizarro's worst suspicions all the same. One can imagine a hurried conference amongst the conquistadors. Do they keep going? Do they turn back? But all these men knew what they had signed up for, more or less. Pizarro was determined. They would keep climbing. Driving his determination was also the sad reality that Pizarro was getting old. Francisco Pizarro was now 54 years old, a little long in the tooth for a conquistador. He recognized he would not have time to hit the reset button and try this again. He had to strike now. It didn't matter whether Atahualpa commanded an army of 10,000 or 10 million. They were going to keep going. So there were 168 Spaniards, 106 of them on foot, and 62 on horseback. The man Pizarro tortured did not know how large Atahualpa's force was, just that it was massive. Certainly, these would-be conquerors realized that they would be vastly outnumbered no matter what. Out in front of the group rode a man who I'm going to do a whole deep dive on when we're done with this, Hernando de Soto. De Soto was not an original member of the expedition. He had arrived in Tumbes with his own retinue shortly before Pizarro set out. Francisco Pizarro immediately made him a captain, and De Soto was only too happy to ride off with his new friends. De Soto really is kind of a fascinating case study in conquistadors and an interesting figure in and of his own. I'm going to go into great detail on him later, but just know for now that De Soto will spend the rest of his life trying to recreate the adventure he now found himself on as a young man. He wanted exactly what Pizarro wanted, to rule over a vast New World empire. Little did he know, the empire he was about to help subdue was the last great New World empire. By Friday, November 15th, the stage was finally set for the second major collision of two civilizations from completely different worlds. The first collision, of course, had been with the Mexica, a fierce struggle that had lasted for 3 years, involved the capture of the Inca Emperor, and culminated with Hernán Cortés directing a mass slaughter and razing the Mexica capital to the ground. Now, as Pizarro and his fellow Spaniards climbed over a mountain pass and looked down for the first time upon the green valley of Cajamarca, located at an elevation of 9,000 feet, two empires, this time the Spanish and the Inca, were once again poised to collide. Here, just a few miles past that Inca town, Atahualpa and his army were encamped, spread out along a hillside beside a vast armada of tents. It was the Spaniards' first glimpse of an Inca army. One present would later write, quote, "So many tents were visible that it truly frightened us. We never thought that Indians could maintain such a magnificent estate, nor have so many tents. Nothing like this had been seen in the Indies up till then. It filled all us Spaniards with confusion and fear, although it was not appropriate for us to show any fear, nor to turn back. For had they sensed any weakness in us, the very Indian porters we were bringing along might have killed us. Thus, with simulated good spirits, and after having thoroughly observed the town and the tents, we descended into the valley and entered the town of Cajamarca." End quote. The Spaniards rode and marched into town 3 abreast and in military formation again, trying to make it look as though they were 100% confident. With the hooves of their horses clacking against the stone-paved streets and storm clouds gathering ominously overhead. But the inhabitants of the town were gone. They had either hidden themselves or fled. Again, we get a description from a Spanish soldier. Quote, "This town, which is the principal town in the valley, is situated on the skirts of a mountain, and there is a league of open plain in front of it. 2 rivers flow through the valley, which is level and well populated and is surrounded by the mountains. The town was supposed to have had 2,000 inhabitants. The plaza is larger than any in Spain and is completely enclosed by a wall. It has 2 doorways that open onto the streets of the town. The houses are more than 200 paces in length and very well made. They are surrounded by strong walls some 15 feet high. The roofs are covered with straw and wood, which rest on the walls, and their walls are of very well-cut blocks of stone." End quote. Pizarro led his men directly into the town square. Just as he did, it began to hail. The tiny balls of ice struck the Spaniard's armor, making little pinging sounds as the ice shattered on the steel. The town looked to be abandoned. Now, as an aside, if this sounds like the perfect scene for a movie on Pizarro, I agree. Please, someone make that movie. Anyway, when no messenger arrived from Atahualpa, Pizarro decided he would send a group to invite the Inca Emperor to a meeting. This small group of 15 horsemen would be led, of course, by Hernando de Soto. This wasn't a random choice. De Soto arrived in Peru already with a sterling martial reputation. He was renowned as a rider, scout, and fighter. With De Soto in the lead, the Spaniards rode up to Atahualpa's camp. According to one eyewitness, quote, the Inca's camp was formed on the flank of a small hill, with the tents, which were of cotton, extending for 3.5 miles, and with Atahualpa's in the center. All the warriors stood outside their tents with their weapons thrust into the ground, which are long lances that resemble pikes. There seemed to be more than 30,000 warriors in the camp, end quote. Soto and his men rode through the legions of motionless Inca infantry who simply stared forward, silent. The troops betrayed no emotion, but they must have been astonished to see bearded men, many of them wearing glinting metal steel armor and riding what looked like some sort of giant alpaca or llama. Avoiding a bridge, the Spaniards splashed their way on horses across a low river, sending beads of water that glistened in the sunlight. At a second river, Soto ordered most of his men to remain, taking only 2 along with him, as well as his interpreter to meet the Inca Emperor. Not far ahead, a native pointed them in the direction of a building that proved to be a sort of bathhouse. 2 stone pipes, one carrying hot thermal water, and the other water that was icy cold, fed into the bath. There, on a small grassy hill before the entryway to the courtyard, sat a man on a low, long stool, wearing a tunic, abundant gold jewelry, and a scarlet sash hanging across his forehead. This man was Atahualpa, and although he might not have looked like an emperor to De Soto quickly realized, because of the avarice deference of those around him, that it could be none other than the Incan Emperor sitting before him. After 3 expeditions, culminating in over 4 years of travel, the advanced guard of Pizarro's latest expedition had finally come face to face with, quote, that great Lord Atahualpa, about whom we had heard so many reports and had been told so many things. He was seated on a small stool, very low to the ground, as the Turks and Moors are accustomed to sit. He projected such majesty and splendor as had never before been seen, end quote. Another eyewitness actually said, quote, he, Atahualpa, was seated on a low stool with all the majesty in the world, surrounded by all of his women and with many chiefs near him, each standing according to his rank, end quote. Although all Inca nobles wore headbands and clothing with patterned symbols that displayed their rank and place of origin, the Inca ruler was the only person, the one and only individual in this empire of, say, 10 million, who was allowed to wear the sacred red royal fringe, or as it's called, and I'm going to do my best on this one, mascapacha. Carefully woven by his female attendants, this delicate fringe was sort of a headband and made of, quote, a very fine scarlet wool, very evenly cut, and very cleverly bound in the middle by small golden tubes. This wool was corded, but below the tubes it was unwound, and this was the part that fell upon the forehead. This fringe fell to just above the eyebrows, was an inch thick, and covered his entire forehead. Hernando de Soto, who I have to admit is a little bit brash, but let's remember he's killed countless natives in hand-to-hand combat. So he rode his horse right up to Atahualpa. So close, apparently, that the horse's breath caused the emperor's royal fringe to momentarily flutter. Atahualpa, however, confronted by a 1,000-pound animal he'd never seen before, and a strange foreigner, wearing his hair long and glinting steel armor, both of which things that he had never seen, he didn't so much as flinch. Instead, Atahualpa kept his eyes to the ground, neither looking up nor even acknowledging De Soto's presence. De Soto, through his interpreter, then began his prepared speech. Quote, "Most serene Inca, you will know that there are in the world two princes more powerful than all the rest. One of them is the Supreme Pontiff, who represents God. He administers and rules all those who keep his divine law and teaches his holy word. The other is the Emperor of the Romans, Charles V, King of Spain. These two monarchs, aware of the blindness of the inhabitants of these realms who disrespect the true God, maker of heaven and earth, and who adore the very demon who deceives them, have sent our governor and captain general Don Francisco Pizarro and his companions and some priests, who are ministers of God, to teach your highness and all his vassals this divine truth and his holy law, for which reason they have come to this country, and having enjoyed the liberality of your royal hand on the way, they entered Cajamarca and have sent us to your highness to lay the foundation of concord, brotherhood, and perpetual peace that should exist between us, so that you may receive us under your protection and hear the divine law from us, and all your people may learn and receive it, for it will be the greatest honor, advantage, and salvation to all." End quote. De Soto seems to have just assumed that his words were translated correctly, and that the background information was sufficient for anyone to understand what he had just said. Of course, literally no one understood what was going on the Inca side. First of all, even contemporary historians questioned the ability of the translator to be able to impart to Atahualpa the meaning of this speech in so few words. Here's what one contemporary said, quote, "With regard to the version of the speech that reached Atahualpa, it is to be remarked that Felipe, the Indian translator who interpreted, was a man of very plebeian, poor origin, young, and as little versed in the general language of the Incas as in the Spanish. He had, in fact, learned the language of the Incas not in Cusco but in Tumbes, from Indians who spoke it barbarously and corruptly as foreigners. To all the Indians but the natives of Cusco, this is a foreign language. He had also learned Spanish without a teacher, but merely by hearing the Spanish speak, and the words he heard most often were those heard by the ordinary soldiers. He also knew the words necessary for fetching anything that was asked for he was a servant and a slave to the Spanish, and he spoke what he knew very corruptly as newly captured Negroes do. Though baptized, he had received no instruction in the Christian religion, and knew nothing about Christ our Lord, and was totally ignorant of the Apostles' Creed. Such were the merits of the first interpreter of Peru. Not a ringing endorsement, to say the least. And even if this young man correctly translated every single word from Spanish into the Incan tongue, you would need a veritable bachelor's degree in history to understand what he was talking about. And Atahualpa didn't know about the Pope. He didn't know about Spain. He didn't even know who the Romans were. How was he supposed to understand and contextualize any of this? So, of course, he probably didn't. Instead, Atahualpa continued to stare at the ground, not moving at all. completely ignoring the Spaniards. In fact, according to one native chronicler, quote, Atahualpa and his nobles were amazed at what they heard of the Spaniards' way of life. Instead of sleeping, these strangers mounted guard at night. They and their horses were supposed to nourish themselves on gold and silver. They apparently wore silver on their feet, and their weapons and their horses' bits and shoes were also reputed to be of silver instead of the iron, which they were really made of. Above all, it was said that all day and all night, the Spaniards talked to their books and their papers, end quote. After a long silence, one of the native chiefs in attendance finally told De Soto that Atahualpa was finishing the last day of his ceremonial fast and was indisposed. He wasn't receiving visitors. At precisely this moment, however, Hernando Pizarro, the brother of Francisco Pizarro, came riding into camp along with two of his bodyguards. He had been sent by his older brother Francisco, who was afraid that De Soto's small party might be attacked. Hernando later wrote, quote, When I arrived and I found the other horsemen near the camp of Atahualpa, and that Captain, De Soto, had gone to speak with him, I left my men there and went ahead with two horsemen, and Captain De Soto announced my approach and explained to him who I was. I then told Atahualpa that Governor Francisco Pizarro had sent me to invite him to come to visit with him, and that he, Pizarro, considered him a friend. When Atahualpa understood that Hernando was the brother of this foreign leader that he wanted to meet, he finally looked up. According to what we have in the sources, these then are the first ever recorded words of an Inca emperor to a citizen of Europe. Quote, Mazicabalica, which means a coastal chief. A captain that I have on the river of Zurica sent me to tell me that you mistreated chiefs and put them in chains. And he sent me an iron collar as proof, and he says that he killed 3 Christians and a horse, end quote. According to one Spanish source, Atahualpa appeared to be about 30 years old. He was, quote, of good appearance and somewhat thick-set, end quote. I guess not surprisingly, Atahualpa's first comment that he made on the record was about the Spaniards' behavior. There were rules and laws in the Inca Empire about how newcomers and envoys were supposed to behave. Pizarro and his band of wandering fools, at least in Atahualpa's eyes, had broken them all. And the Spanish continued to break protocol. When approaching the emperor, an Incan noble was supposed to stare at the ground, genuflect, and carry a symbolic burden on their shoulders. De Soto and his men did none of these things. De Soto probably thought he was showing how powerful he was and how little he was impressed with Atahualpa's entourage. To the Inca, however, this only showed the Spaniards were little more than uncouth barbarians. Needless to say, by this point, Atahualpa was unimpressed. It's now that Hernando Pizarro, again brother to Francisco Pizarro, spoke up. Hernando Pizarro was 31 years old. He was tall, muscular, but the least popular of the Pizarro brothers for reasons that will become obvious. His arrogance would prove a major liability for Francisco Pizarro throughout his time in the New World. So, Hernando decided he would just lie. He insisted that the information Atahualpa had wasn't true. Hernando said, quote, The chief you speak of is a scoundrel, and neither he nor any Indians at all on that river could kill a single Christian. How could they kill Christians or a horse, since they are mere chickens? Hernando paused, waiting for the interpreter to catch up before continuing. Neither Governor Pizarro nor the Christians mistreat the chiefs unless they are hostile towards him, while he treats those who are good and wish to be friends very well. Those who want war are attacked until they are destroyed. When you see what the Christians do while helping you in your wars against your enemies, you'll realize that your chief lied to you, end quote. While heavily outnumbered, the Spanish had a couple of key advantages, and one of them was an advantage in information control. Hernando knew very well that his older brother carried a signed license from the King and Queen of Spain, authorizing the plunder and subjugation of the very empire whose monarch he was addressing. Every member of the Spanish expedition knew about the recent history of Cortés and the Mexica. They themselves, in fact, were hoping very much to repeat in Peru what Cortés had accomplished in Mexico. None of them had any doubt whatsoever that their primary goal was to figure out a way to topple this newly discovered empire, and in doing so, to seize its inhabitants and its wealth for their own, before other Spaniards could arrive and beat them to the punch. Atahualpa, on the other hand, didn't know any of this. He'd never heard of Castile or Charles V. Neither did he know anything about Hernán Cortés and how the Spanish fought. And this is important. Pizarro had a good sense for what worked and what didn't when confronting an indigenous army. Sure, Cortés had not fought the Inca per se, but Pizarro guessed that the transitive property would apply, and that what worked in Mexico would work in Peru. By and large, this was right. This gave the Spanish a massive information advantage over the Inca, which is often overlooked in the history books. Pizarro had guns, horses, and steel. Sure, he did. But he also had information, and the Inca did not. And that advantage really mattered, as we are going to see. At the moment, Atahualpa knew that he could crush this little ragtag army whenever he wanted. But instead, he suggested an alliance. He told Hernando Pizarro that there was a nearby local chief who was refusing to accept Atahualpa's right to rule the region. He said he would give Hernando his nearby army. Together, they could march on this recalcitrant lord and crush him. Hernando only laughed at this suggestion. He told Atahualpa, and this is all through interpreters again, of course, that he alone, with 10 men, could destroy this petty lord. Atahualpa smiled at the suggestion. What could a few of these strange men do against a chief who might summon hundreds of warriors? While all this was going on, Hernando de Soto, who was still present seated on his horse, as were the others, noticed something. Despite the Inca Emperor's seeming casualness with the novelty of their presence, Atahualpa did seem keenly interested in their horses, which goes without saying he had never seen before. De Soto therefore decided to perform a spontaneous demonstration. He backed up his horse and then reared it up so that it stood on its hind legs and snorted. And then he put it through some showy paces. Noticing the wide eyes on the faces of some nearby warriors, De Soto now turned the animal around, dug in his spurs, and suddenly charged directly at them. Although De Soto pulled up at the last moment, the charge sent a number of Atahualpa's elite guards running for cover, with several falling over themselves in a desperate effort to escape. Atahualpa remained seated throughout, watching yet showing no emotion during the entire display. Later that same day, though, he had the entire native battalion executed. They had shown fear in front of foreigners and had thus broken with Inca discipline. The sentence was carried out immediately. Recognizing that he was running out of daylight, De Soto asked the emperor for permission to leave and wanted to know what message he should take back to his leader. Atahualpa granted De Soto permission to go. He also told him that he would visit the town of Cajamarca the next day, where Pizarro had made his camp. Then and there, he would meet with this new leader. De Soto nodded, turned his horse, and rode out of the Inca camp. As he rode away, De Soto could not have known that Atahualpa had already made a decision. Tomorrow, he would kill these foreigners. He would keep a few captive to teach the Inca how to ride these massive beasts they called horses. But in the end, they would all die. The horses he would of course keep to breed. Atahualpa no doubt sat back and smiled. What good luck! Upon returning to the Spanish camp, De Soto and Hernando Pizarro debriefed their commander as to what they had seen and heard. As everyone listened to their report, no doubt the mood turned a touch gloomy. No matter how they all looked at it, they'd gotten themselves into a grim situation. They were 2 weeks' march from Tumbes, where they had left their ships isolated and cut off in the midst of mountains and terrain that they knew not at all. They couldn't retreat because the high passes could be blocked. Besides, to attempt to flee would send an obvious signal of fear and would give the Incas the psychological advantage. Meanwhile, the Inca Emperor was nearby with scores of well-armed and obviously well-organized troops. Hernando Pizarro stated that he had seen perhaps 40,000 warriors. Privately, though, he told his brother Francisco that the real number was probably closer to 80,000 men. That meant that the Spaniards were outnumbered roughly 400 to 1. Now, at the same time, if they chose to wait it out in the city, trying to feign friendship with the Incas, what could they possibly hope to achieve? They could volunteer to fight with the emperor against the Incas' enemies, some of Pizarro's captains suggested, and thus maybe gain an advantage. They would then have to hope that eventually they might somehow wrest power from him at a later date. The Inca lord, however, might decide to toy with them, and at any time might seize their weapons and horses and slaughter them, so said others in the camp. Trying to work with Atahualpa seemed fraught with danger. Another obvious possibility was to try to capture the Inca Emperor. Some of the Spanish captains argued that they should capture Atahualpa just as Cortés had captured Montezuma. Besides, Pizarro and De Soto had been capturing lesser chiefs with various degree of success for decades. But others pointed out that that option too was risky, as they had no guarantee that they would ever actually be in a position to capture Atahualpa. It was an all-or-nothing proposition. If they failed to capture Atahualpa on the first try, then the Incas would have no doubts about their hostile intentions, and open warfare would inevitably ensue. Surely, with such large numbers arrayed against them, the Spaniards would be surrounded and overwhelmed. Moreover, even if they succeeded in capturing Atahualpa, they didn't know what the Inca troops' reaction would be. Just because Cortez's hostage strategy had worked well in Mexico, that didn't mean the same strategy would work in Peru. No matter what option they could think of, all the strategies seemed to share one thing in common. Every single one of them was extremely risky, and the odds were stacked against them. One Spanish notary reported, quote, "We were very scared by what we had seen, and everyone had many views and opinions about what should be done. Everyone was full of fear, for we were so few and were so deep in the land where we could not be reinforced. That night, everybody gathered in Pizarro's quarters to discuss what should be done the following day. Few of us slept, and we kept watch on the square, from which the campfires of the Indian army could be seen. It was a fearsome sight, as most of the campfires were on a hillside and close to one another, making it look like a brilliant, star-studded sky." End quote. For his part, Pizarro knew that the next day would define the rest of his life. His dream of ruling a vast native kingdom, and even his very life, depended on him making the right decision tomorrow. Little did he know, history also hinged on what Pizarro did tomorrow. The following day was Saturday, November 6, 1532. The Spaniards woke before dawn and prepared themselves for war. Pizarro did not know exactly when or how Atahualpa might arrive. He also did not know exactly how events would unfold once he got there. He needed to be able to act spontaneously, so he told his men they would have to follow his lead. He would try to negotiate, but if that failed, then they would need to be ready to act like a spring, cocked into position. Pizarro had decided with so many unknowns. When was Atahualpa going to arrive? How was he going to arrive? How many warriors would he arrive with? He would have to act spontaneously. When the time came, he told his men, he would make a last-minute decision on the precise strategy, whether to try to negotiate, be friendly, escape, or attack. The rest of them would have to just follow his lead. The town's plaza stretched some 600 feet in length by about 600 feet in width. 3 stone buildings, long and low, lined corresponding sides of the square, and each was punctuated by approximately 20 trapezoidal-shaped doorways. Inside these buildings, Pizarro had stationed the cavalry in 3 groups of roughly 20 men. Because of the numerous doorways, the Spaniards could charge out of the buildings simultaneously en masse, if and when needed. Pizarro and some 20 foot soldiers, meanwhile, were to wait in the 3rd building along with a few horsemen. It was their job, if the capture of the emperor became a possibility, to seize Atahualpa at all costs and to make sure that no one harmed him. A dead emperor, after all, would be useless and would probably lead to their immediate destruction. On the far side of the square squatted a 4th building, in which Pizarro had stationed his artillery, with 4 cannons and 8 or 9 harquebuses, plus the remainder of the infantry. Since most of the Spaniards would be hiding within the buildings, and thus would be unable to observe what was happening, the firing of the artillery was the signal to attack. The artillerymen would have to watch Pizarro at all times, he was told. If Pizarro gave the signal, then the artillery would be fired immediately. Every able-bodied person would rush out through the doors into the plaza and attack. The signal would be given, Pizarro told everyone, only if it appeared likely that they could capture Atahualpa, or if the Incas themselves decided to attack. With so many variables at play, Pizarro was determined to hold out the option of parleying with the emperor and of coming to some kind of friendly agreement. That might buy his small force more time with which they might maneuver themselves into a more advantageous situation. If the emperor could be lured inside the walled plaza, however, and if Pizarro did make the decision to attack, at least the Spaniards would have the advantage of surprise. Only through shock, surprise, and confusion, Pizarro knew, did they stand any chance of success. All this preparation the conquistadors did before Atahualpa was even awake. He did not rise until almost 10 in the morning. He didn't expect anything unusual about the day. He would capture and kill this small band of foreigners, and then he'd be on his way. Before he knew it, he would be marching triumphantly through Cusco, the winner of the Civil War. He just had this one pesky errand to get out of the way first. As the sun reached its zenith, the Spaniards finally saw the Inca camp begin to stir. They watched as masses of warriors began to assemble in their different formations. Then, in great order and ceremony, these legions of men slowly began to wheel about and make their way across the plain toward them. Pedro Pizarro, Francisco's 18-year-old cousin and page, recorded as follows, quote, "When his, Atahualpa's, squadrons were formed so that they covered the fields, and when he had seated himself on a litter, he began to proceed. 2,000 Indians marched before him, sweeping the stone-paved road upon which they traveled. Half of his troops marched on one side of the road and half on the other, with neither using the road itself. So great was the amount of table service of gold and silver which they bore, that it was a marvel to observe how it glittered beneath the sun. In front of Atahualpa came many Indians singing and dancing. End quote. As the sound of the approaching warriors grew louder, Pizarro moved from one building to the next, making sure everyone was ready and ordering the cavalrymen to mount their horses with their reins and metal-tipped lances ready in their hands. Then, rather inexplicably, on the plains just outside the town, as many of the Spaniards, quite literally, sweated in fear and anticipation, the native procession suddenly stopped. An hour went by, yet the Spaniards couldn't tell what the Inca were doing. Were they preparing for an attack? Were they receiving last-minute battle instructions? Did Atahualpa just get cold feet? Finally, however, with only a few hours left of daylight, it seemed that Atahualpa and his huge entourage were just going to make camp. At least for today, the several hundred yards that the army had moved was as far as they were going to go. Atahualpa wasn't coming into the town. An exasperated Pizarro quickly sent a Spaniard, whose name was Hernando de Alanda, who spoke a few words of the Inca language, to ride out to Atahualpa's camp. Aldana was instructed to urge the emperor to continue on to the Spaniards' carefully prepared trap, which, with any more delay, might soon be discovered. Aldana dutifully galloped off, crossed the short distance to the camp, dismounted his horse, and then, via hand signs and his very small vocabulary, indicated to Atahualpa that he should proceed into the town before the setting of the sun. Apparently, the message was understood, for as Aldana raced back, the Spaniards saw the Inca formation begin to move. Soon, Atahualpa's bearers lifted the emperor, already seated in his litter, onto their shoulders. The litter itself consisted of an elegantly constructed wooden box mounted on two long poles, with a seat and cushions and a canopy. The procession then slowly began to make its final approach toward the great square of Cajamarca. With no doubt that the massed troops were about to arrive, and with some of his men scarcely able to conceal their fear, Pizarro and his brother Hernando began visiting the different buildings in order to give their final encouragements to the men. One notary recorded as follows, quote, "The governor, Pizarro, and Captain General Hernando Pizarro visited the quarters of the Spaniards, making sure that they were ready to rush forth when it was necessary, and telling them all that they must make fortresses of their hearts, for they had no others and no hope than God, who would help those in the greatest need who worked in his service. And he told them that although for every Christian there were 500 Indians, that they must make the same effort that all good men are accustomed to make at such times, and that they must trust that God would fight on their side. He told them that when the time came to attack, that they must rush out with desperate fury and break through the enemy ranks, taking care that the horses did not get in the way of each other. The governor and the captain general spoke these similar words to Christians in order to encourage them, and they wanted to go out and fight rather than remain in their quarters." End quote. Outside, as the sound of the approaching Indians grew louder, the first warriors began to spill through one of the gateways onto the broad plaza. For those who dared to look, they saw, in this account of the same man, quote, "First came a squadron of Indians dressed in colorful uniform that looked like a chessboard. They marched while removing straws from the ground and sweeping the path. Behind these came 3 squadrons dressed in a different manner, all of them singing and dancing. Then came many men wearing armor, thin metal plates, and crowns of gold and silver. Among them traveled Atahualpa, in a litter lined with multicolored macaw feathers and adorned with plates of gold and silver." Another man described the scene as follows, quote, 80 lords carried the Inca lord on their shoulders, all wearing very rich blue uniforms. He himself was very richly dressed, with his crown on his head and a necklace of large emeralds around his neck. He was seated in the litter on a very small stool that bore a sumptuous curtain." And the first notary finishes, quote, "Behind him came 2 other litters and 2 hammocks in which rode other important leaders. And lastly came squadrons of men with crowns of gold and silver. After the first group had entered the square, they parted to make room for the others. Then, as Atahualpa reached the center of the square, he made the rest of them halt, while the litter in which he was traveling and the others were held up high. People continued to pour into the square without ceasing. Soon, Atahualpa and maybe 5,000 to 6,000 warriors crowded into the square, filling it up. The wide plaza was now like a packed theater, with only 2 small exits. Because of the great number of troops and the relative lack of space, Atahualpa had ordered that the rest of his legions wait outside. The crowd of nobles and warriors on the square became quiet, and a light breeze blew. Visible in the building at the far end, 4 nondescript lumps of bronze with holes protruding from the doorways, looking like some sort of ornament. They were actually 4 small cannons, charged and ready to fire. An Inca nobleman with distinct plugs in his earlobes now walked towards the building, as the artillerymen held their breath. Instead of going inside, however, he suddenly stopped and thrust a lance he was carrying into the ground, then walked back. From the lance flapped a cloth banner. This was Atahualpa's royal standard, a personal coat of arms that was always displayed wherever the emperor happened to be present. As Atahualpa waited, wearing a soft wool tunic and seated upon a small stool on his litter, the Spaniards pressed against the stone, cold walls of the buildings, fingering their weapons and staying out of sight. Others sat on their horses, leaning forward, trying to keep their animals from whinnying or making any other noise. At last, Atahualpa called out to them, ordering the Spaniards to emerge from their hiding places and show themselves. But the square remained completely silent, with only the sound of the royal standard flapping in the breeze. Finally, from one of the buildings, 2 figures came out. One was a man dressed unlike any of the other foreigners Atahualpa had seen, wearing a long robe tied at the waist with a rope and carrying what appeared to be some gifts in his hand. A shiny ornament of silver that looked like a broken stick. It was actually a crucifix. And a black, square-shaped object, perhaps a ceremonial cloth. It was actually a prayer book. Atahualpa watched as a robed foreigner and his interpreter picked their way through the Inca warriors and approached his litter. Standing before the Inca lord, who ruled with as much divine right as any European king, the friar, and of course he was a friar, began by inviting the emperor to dismount from his litter and enter one of the buildings. There, he told him, he could meet with Governor Pizarro and speak and dine with him. The friar knew, of course, that if Atahualpa did so, it would be so much easier for the Spaniards to capture him. Atahualpa refused, stating, quote, "I will not leave this place until you return all that you have taken from my land. I know very well who you are and what you have been doing," end quote. Now the time had come for the typical reading of the requerimiento, the document required by all Spanish monarchs before a people and their territory and their things could be seized and or killed, destroyed. In a loud voice, the friar began to paraphrase it, with the young interpreter doing probably the best he could. Said, quote, "In the name of the high and mighty kings of Castile and Leon, conquerors of barbarian people, and being their messenger, I, the friar, hereby notify and inform you that God, our Lord, one and eternal, created heaven and earth and a man and a woman from you, and I and all people of the world are descended. Because of the great multitudes begotten from these past 5,000 years, some since the world was made, God placed one called Saint Peter in charge of all these people." The friar paused as the translator translated, the feathers on Atahualpa's litter blowing in the breeze. Then he continued, "And so I request and require you to recognize the Church as your mistress and as governess of the world and universe, and the high priest called the Pope in her name and his majesty in her place as ruler of Lord King. And if you do not do this, with the help of God, we shall come mightily against you, and we shall make war on you everywhere and in every which way that we can. And we shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and his majesty. and we shall seize your women and children, and we shall make them slaves to sell and dispose of as his majesty commands, and we shall do all the evil and damage to you that we are able. And I must insist that the deaths and destruction that result from this will be all your fault." End quote. Now, how the interpreter explained terms like Castile, Leon, and Pope to Atahualpa, we'll never know. But my guess is Atahualpa stood, listened, and had absolutely no idea what was going on. That would be the response of just about every Native American who this was read to. But after the interpreter finished delivering what he could of the speech, silence swept the square. For a moment, time just stood still, as two empires stood watching each other. At stake for Atahualpa and the Inca elite were their vast lands, their 10 million tax-paying peasants, and an empire that had taken 3 generations and countless military campaigns to create. At stake for the Spanish monarchy was a little less. A ragtag group of maybe 168 expendable conquistadors, a handful of merchants, a few black slaves, and a couple of women. Whether any of the individual protagonists in this understood the basic historical consequences involved at this particular moment is very doubtful. But the Spaniards, wearing armor and chainmail and preparing themselves for the attack, were certainly aware that their own lives and fortunes lay in the balance. Yet the Spaniards also knew that if somehow they were able to escape from their present situation and were miraculously able to conquer this empire, that both their own fortunes and the king's domains would be vastly expanded. The friar, as well, on a religious level, realized that success here meant the expansion of the earth of the Christian church, and hence an expansion of God's dominion. The reverse would be a victory for the forces of Lucifer and for pagan barbarians of the world. It was precisely the non-believers' refusal to accept the word of God, the friar believed, that was delaying the reappearance of Christ on earth. That was actually a widely held belief. A bold success here meant that the kingdom of God would surely arrive much, much sooner. Among the Incas, only Atahualpa's top military leaders apparently knew of his plan to capture and kill the Spaniards, to make eunuchs out of the survivors, and to breed these powerful and majestic animals, that is, the horses. Atahualpa could hardly have thought that this small group of foreigners, who presently appeared to be cowering from fear inside a few buildings, were any threat. After listening to the inevitably mangled translation of the friar's speech, Atahualpa appeared to be puzzled, for the friar now held up his prayer book and insisted that everything he stated was contained within. Indeed, the Christian God's own voice was evidently contained within this book. Atahualpa leaned forward and asked to see the strange object. The friar dutifully held up the prayer book towards Atahualpa's golden litter, and the emperor took hold of it. As the friar watched Atahualpa fumble with the book, turning it over and inside out, however, he realized that Atahualpa didn't know how to open it. He'd never seen a book before. The friar stepped forward, reaching out his hand in order to show the emperor how it was done. Now recounting one of the witnesses, quote, "With great scorn, Atahualpa struck the friar on the arm, not wishing that it should be opened. Then stubbornly he opened it himself. Without any astonishment at the letters on the paper, nor at the paper, as it had been displayed by other Indians, he threw it 5 or 6 paces away from him. And to the words that the friar had spoken to him through the interpreter, he answered with much arrogance, stating, quote, 'I know how well you have behaved on the road, how you have treated the chiefs, and have taken the royal cloth from the storehouses. I will not leave this place until they are returned to me.'" End quote. Now, according to some eyewitnesses, and it's a little bit mangled here, but Atahualpa now stood up in his litter and began shouting to the troops to prepare themselves for battle. The interpreter scrambled to retrieve the prayer book from the ground. Meanwhile, the friar rushed back to Pizarro's quarters, agitated, and began shouting, come out, Christians! come at these enemy dogs who reject the things of God. Clutching the crucifix, he then shouts that the chief has thrown the holy book of God to the ground. Another witness heard the friar shouting, "Didn't you see what happened? Why remain so polite and servile toward this arrogant dog when the plains are full of Indians? Go and attack him, for I will absolve you." The moment had arrived. The moment when history turns. With Atahualpa standing on his litter and the priest apoplectically shouting for the Spaniards to attack, Pizarro had to make a choice. He hesitated only a moment, and then he signaled to the artillery. The wicks were lit, and with loud roars the cannon fired directly into the mass of warriors, spewing out smoke and metal shrapnel. Simultaneously, 9 huckabussers also fired their guns, carefully aiming them on the tripods. The sudden explosion no doubt stunned the native warriors, as did the sight of bodies suddenly falling down among them and spurting blood. With plumes of smoke rising from one of the buildings, they now heard coming from all directions the stark sounds of trumpets and multiple choruses of men shouting "Santiago" as the Spaniards kicked their feet into their horses and charged and ran out from their hiding places. From every direction, Atahualpa's warriors suddenly saw metal-covered foreigners, suddenly rushing towards them, together with groups of seemingly ferocious 1,000-pound animals in padded armor, their hooves pounding the ground, and each topped by a lance or sword-wielding Spaniard screaming with a crazed look in their eyes. The Spaniards began slashing, stabbing, impaling, hacking, and even beheading as many natives as they could, using their razor-sharp swords, knives, and lances. The native warriors, having confidently marched onto the square only moments earlier and thinking that they had trapped the cowering foreigners in a few buildings, now suddenly realized that they were in a trap. Attacking from all sides and suddenly crushing the warriors together, the Spaniards' attack threw the natives into an immediate panic. The giant horses, with mounted Spaniards, had the same effect on the Inca troops, in fact, than, let's say, Hannibal's men on elephants must have had on a Roman legion 1,500 years earlier. Terrified masses of warriors began surging toward the square's narrow exits, trampling those who got in the way and seized by an overwhelming desire to run and to save themselves. But the Spaniards mercilessly and methodically continued to cut off arms, hands, and heads using steel weapons like meat cleavers. Quote, "They were so filled with fear that they climbed on top of one another to such an extent that they formed mounds and suffocated each other," said one witness of the natives trying to flee. Another wrote, quote, "The horsemen rode out on top of them, wounding and killing and pressing home the attack." Pizarro, meanwhile, with his 20-foot soldiers, immediately began slicing his way through the crowd in the direction of Atahualpa, who still stood on his litter, attempting to rally his panic-stricken troops. According to one eyewitness, quote, "Pizarro armed himself with a thick cotton coat of armor, took his sword and dagger, and entered into the midst of the Indians with the Spaniards who were with him. With great bravery, and with only 4 who could follow him, he reached Atahualpa's litter and fearlessly grabbed the emperor's left arm, shouting 'Santiago!' But he could not pull him out of his litter, which was still held high. All those who were carrying Atahualpa's litter appeared to be important men, and they all died, as all did those who were traveling in litters and hammocks." Pedro Pizarro would describe it as, quote, "Although the Spaniards killed the Indians who were carrying the litter, other replacements immediately went to support it. They continued in this way for a long time, struggling with and killing the Indians, until becoming exhausted, one Spaniard tried to stab Atahualpa with his knife to kill him. But Francisco Pizarro parried the blow, and in doing so, the Spaniard trying to kill Atahualpa wounded Pizarro on the hand. Finally, as the desperate struggle to seize the emperor continued, 7 or 8 Spanish horsemen now turned their horses and spurred them, going directly towards Atahualpa's litter. Pushing against the bloodied nobles trying to steady it, the Spaniards then heaved onto one side, turning the litter over. Other Spaniards now pulled the emperor from his seat, wielding his sword in one hand and fastening upon Atahualpa with the other. Pizarro and a group of Spaniards now rushed Atahualpa back to Pizarro's lodgings, thus imprisoning him. Pandemonium, coupled with the slaughter, continued to reign on the square. As the hordes of trapped warriors continued to try and flee toward the overcrowded exits, those furthest from them, in complete desperation, now began to surge against the far wall, which was about 6 feet high. Thousands lunged against it until finally a 15-foot section simply gave away and tumbled. As the terrified natives scrambled over and through it, the Spaniards on horseback raced after them, spearing, lancing, cutting, and stabbing. Those eyewitnesses who recorded the event remembered the horsemen chasing the warriors out onto the plain, at first singling out the litters of Inca nobles who were still being borne away by their royal retainers. All these men were shouting, quote, "After those in uniforms, don't let any escape. Spear them, end quote. And so the slaughter just continued, the Spaniards chasing after the fleeing natives, inflicting as much carnage as possible, and in the light and long shadows, suddenly, all that was left were corpses. Elsewhere, hundreds lay trampled to death on the square. Some were still alive, crawling, moaning, many dying or dead, gradually losing consciousness. Again, one eyewitness wrote, quote, "One of the men killed in one of the litters was Atahualpa's page and the lord of Chinicha, whom he regarded very highly, and the others were also lords over so many people, were his advisors. The lord of Cajamarca also died. Other commanders died, but there were so many of them that they go unrecorded. For all those who came in, Atahualpa's bodyguards were great lords. It was a marvelous thing to see so great a ruler captured in such a short time, when he had come with such a strong force," end quote. Now, interestingly, although the Spaniards had feared that Atahualpa's warriors had arrived bearing hidden weapons, not once that afternoon did a native warrior ever raise a weapon against a Spaniard. If they had concealed weapons, then they simply suffered too much shock to use them. In the space of just a few hours, the Spaniards had killed or wounded perhaps 6 or maybe even 7,000 natives, while they themselves hadn't lost a single man. And now, in the end, Atahualpa, no longer borne on a golden litter, his beautiful tunic stained with the blood of his own nobles, turned to face his captors, one of whom was a tall, helmeted man wearing his still bloodied and padded armor, Francisco Pizarro. If you've liked the show, please consider supporting us for $1 a month. That's $12 a year. Helps me continue to make these things happen. You can do that at the Patreon site. Link is in the show notes. Patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast. You can also give Western Civ 2.0 a try, free trial. Link is in the show notes for that as well. And as always, if you're looking for more content or teaching resources, you can check out the website, westerncivpodcast.com.